All right, how is everyone doing today? And I turned just welcome to my channel, and we're going to get into another Bible decode today, number 113, coming from Michael Menescat's. I was just going to say, when I was turning on the video, I just kind of like rammed my whole hand right into the button. I don't know, it was kind of an involuntary jerk, but those things happen. And anyway, you're going to get some great information here on this channel from going through this book from Michael Menescat's, Menasgotz, his new book called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult. It just came out about 6 months ago, and he is in the Roman origins camp. Many authors, especially quite a few recently in the last 25 years, who have gone from the initial point that the New Testament was written by the Romans, by the Caesars. It's a fraud, it is fiction, and it is a piece of wartime propaganda that the Romans used against the Jews. They were fighting the Jews almost constantly for the last 100 years before this, or more. One insurrection after a revolt, after an uprising, after a war, after an uprising, after an insurrection. And the Jews were quite unlike a lot of the other nations that were under the Roman Empire. They were separatists. They believed they were the chosen people. They had a monotheistic God. They had a ton of strange rituals having to do with not only circumcision, but also animal sacrifice, Passover, and other sacrifices that they had to make. And they had a stricture against graven images that really upset the Caesars, who wanted to put their statue in their temple. And not only that, but they were willing to die to maintain these rituals. And so the Romans were willing to kill them. But the thing was that the Romans had so many different people under their empire that they were just placing an inordinate amount of time in dealing with the Jews. And, it was making them spread thin for, the rest of the different people that they had under their empire. So, and this culminated in what was called the War of the Jews, or the Jewish War, from 66 to 73 AD, where the Jews actually kicked out the Roman, sentinels, and the people that were kind of in charge of guarding the area. And Emperor Nero countered by bringing in the big guns, led by General Vespasian, and put a siege on Jerusalem. This Jewish war started right then, and this is the subject of this book by Josephus called The Jewish War, or War of the Jews. And this is very important to the overall story here, because it's part of the plan, part of the psychological operation that the Romans did. So the Jews were waiting for a Messiah all the way from back in the Old Testament times. There were many Messiahs prophesied, and they were waiting for them. And there were 3 kind of Messiah candidates that emerged here during this Jewish war. Eleazar, John, and Simon were 3 of the leaders of the zealots there. And the Romans wanted to counter that. And so the Romans wrote up a story, and they backdated it by 40 years, back into the really from the early 70s to the early 30s. And they wrote up a story of a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and who believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, who believed in turning the other cheek to oppression, who believed in forgiving the Romans for they know not what they do, and who believed in walking an extra mile with the Roman soldier's backpack, and in the Roman slave owner having the greatest faith in all of Judea. And at the same time, he went to the temple and he overturned the tables of the money changers, who were the Jews who were there turning the Roman money that had graven images of Caesar on them into Jewish money so that they could bring them into the temple. So this was a key aspect of the Jewish ritual. And same with he disrupted all of the people that were selling doves and pigeons and lambs and rams outside of the temple. And that, again, is another, central aspect of the Jewish ritual. So this Prince of Peace that the Romans proposed was 100% pro-Roman and anti-Jew. And, then you even go further and you go into the Paul epistles, and he's even more pro-Roman and less Jewish. And he's even more pro-slavery, which is, what the Romans were into. 10 to 15% of the population of the Roman Empire were slaves. And, Paul goes right out and says slaves have an obligation to obey their masters. So the writing should, this should have set off red flags. And I don't know why it hasn't, other than like cognitive dissonance and a little bit of propaganda that, most people, when they think of the Romans, they think of persecuting Christians. They think of Christians versus lions. They think, that the Romans were, putting Christians into the Colosseum to have them sacrificed for their own entertainment. And really, when you look at that, it's really Jews that were being put into those, those arenas. The line between Christian and Jew was very permeable at this time, because the people that followed Jesus were Jews. And just because they followed Jesus, they didn't think that they had adopted a new religion. It took a while before they recognized, and it took Paul really, the whole separateness that Paul is really talking about in his epistles, for them to recognize that there was actually like a kind of a fork in the road there. And, the Christians don't need to keep those rituals. They just have to believe in Jesus. But the Jews have to keep the rituals and they, have this monotheistic God. And the Christians are going off with this Trinity God. And so, there was little difference between Christians and Jews for a very long time. And then that's really talking about a lot of the persecution that occurred under Nero from 54 to 68 AD, but then also Domitian, who was one of the Flavian emperors in the 80s and early 90s AD. He was known for his persecution of Christians, but what he was really persecuting is he was persecuting members of his own family that become Christians in order to worship Titus, his older brother. He was jealous of his older brother. And so these are the people that created the Gospels, the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, which include Vespasian, the general who eventually became emperor in 69 AD, his son Titus, who Vespasian appointed as the new general when Vespasian became the new emperor. And then Titus eventually became emperor in 79 AD when Vespasian died. And Titus only lived another 2 years, and then Domitian took over. So those three emperors were the main area where this psychological operation of the Gospels was born. Now, it may have hatched much earlier than that, going back all the way to the reign of Tiberius, who was actually, reigned from 14 to 37 AD. And Nero, he executed a couple of people that I think they presented the idea was hatched way back then, but never really got off the ground because they couldn't find like an emperor who was ready to sanction it. And this is really like the Piso family. Lucius Piso, Gaius Piso, these two brothers, along with Pliny the Elder, Seneca, and a few others, I think were in charge of creating a new Roman religion. And that was part of this, but then Nero wouldn't go for it, and so they tried to assassinate Nero, and Nero caught them and eventually executed Seneca, who was originally his tutor, and he executed Gaius Piso and I think a few others. So anyway, so they backdated the story by 40 years, and then they wrote the story of Josephus. Josephus is a person who never really existed, but he was the pen name, probably, of this guy, Arius Piso, son of Gaius. And he, but whoever was Josephus, was the exact same person who wrote the New Testament, or at least the Gospels, and then the rest of the New Testament later. Most scholars will tell you that the Pauline epistles were written before the Gospels, but I seriously doubt that. There's only one piece of evidence that they have, which is that the Pauline epistles do not refer to the things that were in the Gospels, and therefore they were written before them, because otherwise they would have. And that doesn't really add up. A lot of the things in Christianity fall apart because a lot of them are based on one fact, that then, like Josephus is seen as being a corroborator of the existence of Jesus. He is the only person other than the writers of the New Testament to corroborate the existence of Jesus in the entire first century. But then when you recognize that he was an insider to the Roman emperors, lived at Caesar's palace, and was a family member, an adopted family member of Vespasian and Titus's, then that falls apart as well. And that is in Josephus's own autobiography, that's what happened. So, there's a lot of rug pulling involved here. But what Michael Menescotz does, going back, they backdated it by 40 years. A lot of the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament are fulfilled by Titus in War of the Jews by Josephus. And the place where Jesus makes them is the same place where Titus fulfills them. The date that Jesus makes the prophecy is 40 years, often to the day, sometimes to the hour of the time that Titus fulfills them. that basically means that Titus is the second coming of Jesus, and that what you're looking for in the book of Revelation about the second coming of Jesus has already happened almost 2,000 years ago. And there are many other themes of the parallels that are also involved. Um, the the links between Josephus's War of the Jews and the Gospels are legion, to quote the New Testament, thousands of them. Michael Menescatz, the author of this book here, he dug into the book of Luke, and he found 250 parallels between the book of Luke and the Jewish War by Josephus. And he also says that I'm sure I missed a lot of them, because a lot of them are inside jokes. You have to have like kind of another piece of information before you can figure some of them out. Some of them are very obvious. Some of them are kind of weak. Some of them will knock your socks off. So they run the gamut. And also what Menescatz did is he graphed them out. He put them on a chart with the book of Luke on the vertical axis and Josephus on the horizontal axis. Every time he found a parallel, he plotted the point. And he discovered that after plotting all the points, that the pattern is not random. It actually creates 5 near perfect letters in Latin: APTVS, perhaps Arius Piso Titus Vespasian, and then S, whatever. So that more or less means that not only did the Romans write the New Testament, but they also signed their name to it. And that is kind of the level of the humor that the Romans use. It's a mocking, bitter, blunt, brutal, grim, black, pornographic, cannibalistic, violent humor at your expense. And if so, again, the New Testament is a limited hangout. Like all psychological operations, there is some stuff in there that is good. That is stuff that you can build a religious foundation off of. But that is in there to draw you into it. But the poison stuff that's in it is hidden, mostly hidden. But but once you read Josephus, it's not nearly as hidden as it was. And so you can start to kind of piece it together once you start to read Josephus's 7 volumes of his Jewish War. Okay, so we're going to look at some more parallels here that Menescatz finds about Jesus, the parallels between Jesus and Josephus and their life stories. Because Josephus tells his story in his book, and it's mostly a parody of Jesus' story. But before you object to that, you can also find many, many passages where Jesus and the New Testament is parodying Josephus. So the parodying is mutual. It's going back and forth. It's not just one way. So whoever wrote one also wrote the other at the same time for the same reason. Okay, now let's start with the Menescatz. And just like Jesus in Luke, Jewish War describes how Josephus' story involves an adult version of a lamb hung from a wooden cross, 3 wooden towers with men on them, a great trumpet sound, a great shaking, the daylight being darkened, and cloth at the gates of the city being torn. And for this, he goes to Luke 23, verses 32, 44, and 45. They have Jesus, the adult Lamb of God, hung from a wooden cross with 3 crosses with men on. At his death, the sun is darkened, the earth shakes, there is a great trumpet sound, and the veil of the temple is torn. John adds that as Jesus was crucified, lambs were slaughtered. And this links up with Jewish War, paragraph 409, 410, 417, and 420, which are all in Book 3, Chapter 7, paragraphs 19 through 30. Vespasian brings a battering ram, and the tip is sculpted into the shape of a ram. So it's an adult version of a lamb. So it's in the shape of an adult version of a lamb. And this is hung between a wooden cross. He also arranges 3 wooden towers with men on, and trumpeters to blast noise, and the sky is darkened by the darts his men fire. His battering ram makes the walls shake. Josephus intervenes by hanging great cloth bags of chaff down the battlements to be in front of the gates to soften the ram's blows, but the Romans tear them down. So you can see that there are many, many points of parallel there, but there's nothing really that you can say is a smoking gun. It's like, well, that could be a coincidence. There's kind of a lot there. The trumpeters, the battering ram, the wooden crosses, 3 of them, the torn, cloth, and but it could be a coincidence, except that there are 250 of these just in the book of Luke. And so, you can explain away one of them, or you can explain away 10 of them, but it's really hard to explain away 250 of them. And some of them are a lot stronger than that. And some of them are works of genius that they must have spent so much time putting this together. Again, some of them are weak. There are probably 50 of them that are pretty weak. But there are also probably 50 of them that are really strong. So, some of them are just there to put a dot on the chart, where they sign their name. Okay, next parallel. And just like Jesus in Luke, Jewish War describes how Josephus was set to die before a crowd, with those involved being Simon, Jesus, John, with either Joseph or Joseph's wife. This goes to Luke 23:26. Has Jesus being led to Golgotha to die after being whipped, with many unnamed people watching. And Simon the Cyrene was made to bear his cross, whilst Mary, Joseph's wife, was present, and John claims to have been present. Meanwhile, Jewish War 356, Book 2, Chapter 21, Paragraph 3. Josephus was accused of corruption, so John, under the authority of a man called Jesus, now that's John, one of the zealots for the Jews. So Josephus was one of the Jewish generals in the war. Eventually, he surrendered to Vespasian and defected to the Romans, and Vespasian adopted him into his family and made him the court historian for the Romans, which, to me, completely, I can't possibly believe that's true. There's other stuff in Josephus that's completely not believable. He talks about a river called the Sabbatean River or something like that only flows on Sundays, or maybe it stops flowing on Sundays. One of the two, but ridiculous. Anyway, Josephus was accused of corruption. So John, under the authority of a man called Jesus, and there are about 6 characters named Jesus in Josephus's War of the Jews, all of whom are mockeries of the Jesus in the Gospels. Under the authority of a man called Jesus, came with a mob, causing his friends to flee, barring 4 unnamed ones. But then his autobiography clarifies that he had only one remaining friend, who was called Simon. he implicitly expecting to die, but instead has one of his enemies whipped. I wish he would provide the actual passage there. He usually does. I'm not sure why he's not doing it here. Okay, next parallel. And just like Jesus in Luke, Jewish War describes how in Josephus' story regarding the conflict with the Romans, a man who was high up on something analogous to a cross miraculously escaped death by divine providence, which involved leaving it and directly entering a subterranean cave, which caused the Romans to think he was dead. But how on the third day that man spoke to those searching for him, and how he was then to become their leader. In Luke, this is plainly Jesus, who is taken from the cross, put in the grave, rose on the third day, spoke to those searching his grave for him, and was to come again as leader. For example, in his second coming, he was to claim the earth as his kingdom. And he uses Luke 23, 32, and 53 for that. In Jewish War 371, Book 3, Chapter 2, Paragraph 3, in the same battle where Josephus was fighting, a man called Niger was in a tower, which in view of the parallel to earlier, tower can be seen as intended to be a metaphor for Jesus' cross. And he leapt from the tower into a subterranean cave and was preserved there. The Romans thought him dead, but on the third day he spoke out to those searching for him, and he came up as if by divine providence to become their future leader, replacing Josephus, who was captured. Next parallel. And just like Jesus in Luke, Jewish War describes how in Josephus' story and during that same conflict, a Jewish man from Galilee refused to defend himself, and he was pierced in 5 places by the Romans, and high up he was displayed to the multitude outside the city, presenting in effect an adult version of a lamb. And in a sense, he was next to 2 men, whilst the person linked to Salome moved a very great stone, with a key person's foot being pierced, leaving the son in agony. S-O-N, son in agony. Once again, in Jesus' story, this all relates to Jesus' death, Luke 23:33. Most of this is fairly self-evident, but the story continues with Luke 24:10, where the women, including Salome, came to Jesus' grave and asked, "Who shall roll the stone away?" but found that it was already rolled away, despite being very great. And parodying this in Jewish War, paragraph 411, book 3, chapter 7, paragraph 21, we have the son of Salome lifting an enormous stone. So the character is referred to as the son of Salome. And again, you can get a copy of Josephus online as a PDF for free, and you can go over all this yourself to make sure. You don't have to believe me on this. This is something that you can confirm for yourself, and you can decide for yourself. You probably can find other parallels that Menescots didn't find, especially if you know a good deal about Roman history and even Jewish history. Okay, now we have the son of Salome lifting an enormous stone and using it to break the iron ram sculpture, an adult version of a lamb, off the tip of the battering ram. And he took it without defending himself and displayed it high up on the walls of Jerusalem to the soldiers outside Jerusalem, and was pierced in 5 places by Roman darts and died up there. Jewish War continues, saying, quote, "Next to him, 2 brothers showed their courage And then Vespasian himself was pierced in the foot by a dart too, which caused the son, S-O-N, to be in agony. So that refers to the son Titus, his son Titus, who is concerned for his father. So that does make a parallel kind of unexpectedly. But many of the parallels are like that, where it's kind of like it hits you like it's a curveball. They make a parallel that you're not really expecting. Okay, now, and just like Jesus in Luke, Josephus describes, in this case, in his autobiography rather than Jewish War, how his story involves a trio of men being crucified together, some distance outside of the walls of Jerusalem, but that whilst two of them died, one of them was brought down and survived. For Jesus' story, this does not need explaining. Jesus can be said to have survived, since he resurrected from the dead. The other two people on the crosses died. For Josephus' story, we must now refer to his autobiography, paragraph 75, where he recalls how during a journey back from Thekoa, a 10-mile journey from the south, whose midpoint is at or near Bethlehem, he saw 3 former acquaintances being crucified, and he begged Emperor Titus, or who was the general then, he begged Titus, who had them brought down, but 2 died while the 3rd recovered. It is perhaps worth noting that Jewish War mentions that Josephus's acquaintances include the high priest Jesus, who became his adversary, but who he speaks of fondly, and that when Josephus talks about Jesus and Ananus being killed, Ananus is another high priest, I believe, being killed, he does so mentioning simultaneously that other people were crucified and taken down and buried. Okay, so that's about all we have time for. That is, I think we just went through 5 parallels there, and I think that that's pretty clear that there is something fishy going on. Now, you probably, if you would get beyond that if you heard 5 more and then 5 more and 5 more and 5 more, and you kept hearing all of these different parallels. That's why I'm presenting all of them in this book, but you can't do it all at once. Some of them are complicated. So thanks for tuning in today, and like, share, subscribe, and comment, and come back. Have a great night.